really excited to share David with us today, and let me tell you why. Because to me, you're a polymath, right? Not only you're a virtuoso musician, you're a screenwriter, and you do many, many other things. Why don't we set an intention? So my intention for our conversation today is to get to know you even more, to explore further what we've been discussing, but secondarily also to share, your wisdom, your tactical disciplines type things. So should people be inspired by your narrative, and they can take on or emulate part of what you do, right? That's my intention. What would your intention be?
Well, as a general intention, I like exploring the inquiry together, more as a mutual form of discovery. I find myself presently in my life in a state of curiosity, where I think we're all involved in a joint conversation, dialogue. So to just land my understanding as well as my curiosity and discover together. Just more wisdom, more truth, possibly.
Yeah, absolutely. And really that you're touching upon the intention of this podcast. Because oftentimes when I hear podcasts, I hear people promoting their point of view as the truth versus an inquiry. Because ultimately we all have pieces of puzzle, and then inquiring together is the intention.
Yeah, I don't necessarily believe that one truth is the truth. I think everything has an element of truth. And so the more beliefs we can incorporate and welcome, the more flexible we can become in allowing these beliefs to be considered, at least. Even if they're not necessarily embraced, just the act of considering the potential validity of any idea allows a more broad perspective and possibly also helps achieve better states of patience, compassion, forgiveness, understanding, both for our own self as well as others.
Absolutely.
So in that sense, there's sort of an idea. At least I reside less in a place of holding on to any truth rather than being in the curiosity. There is we often seek answers. There's a little story that I read a while back that was really sweet about this being that is sitting on a bench with a little box, and this other being comes and sits next to it and says, what's in your box? And he goes, it's my box of questions. And this other being, they're kind of characters in this story, they're not people, they're meant to be metaphors. Says, well, why would you want a box of questions? It's so much better to have answers, right? And through this conversation that takes place, the little character, the main character that has the box, says, well, what's beautiful is my questions always stay with me. They keep me going places and discovering things, whereas when you have an answer, that's it, you're done. The journey ends.
Exactly.
And so although we're always seeking answers, these days I prefer to sit and seek questions and keep them as alive as I can, because they fuel my curiosity. And thus they get me to travel places, meet people, discover new music. And I think that an answer can be sometimes useful, but it's conclusive, it closes. There's a closed chapter in an answer. It's a period at the end.
Right.
And so it ends. It ends the story. And I like the story continuing to unfold in a natural way.
So, and I think part of it, and I get particularly excited to talk to polymath, because there is somehow a through line, at least one that I can detect, that is that exactly the point that you were making, that curiosity, and then you start to pull the thread, and the exploration versus finding answer as an in order to something, and then that's a period point and it stops.
I'm just curious, and I do want the answers. The difference between where I am today versus where I was 20 years ago is that back then I was content finding the answers, whereas today I'm more content finding the question that keeps me seeking. You know, I'm less attached to the destination, if you will, to use that old metaphor. It's the journey, not the destination. To me, it's the question, not necessarily the answer. But the question is really what drives the whole thing. So whether it be a curiosity about, say, painting, or history, or politics, or music, or mathematics, it's all stems from, I think, an interest in discovering patterns, and the reason why my interests are diverse is fundamentally because I try to find correlations and parallels between different art forms at first, and then eventually between art forms and certain scientific fields that I also find interesting, worth studying. And I start to recognize that there is a lot of similarities in all these different fields. So the knowledge from one can often apply, at least the methodology from one can often apply to another paradigm with minor adjustments.
One of the saying is the quality of your life depends on the quality of the questions that you ask. So what kind of questions do you ponder, that you think about?
They've changed throughout years. I've spent many different chapters of my life focusing on different ideas. Everything from the big themes, love, death, the meaning of life, definitely the big existential cornerstones that I think all humans are, at least, if not preoccupied by, at least in some sort of inner awareness of as life unfolds. Relationships, of course, but then broadening it to just through a certain path of studying different practices, some Buddhism, some different philosophies, if you will. Not all spiritual per se, although all fundamentally exist, spiritual in their own way. Is the question of how does my experience fit into the big picture? What are the consequences of my thoughts, and what am I the result of other consequences? What domino am I as the dominoes fall? As I push the domino ahead of me, of course, it's going to continue propelling this dynamic. But I also got pushed by eons worth of conditions and situations that make me who I am, and even inform how I perceive life. So as I really reflect on that, so it begins really this question of, this is still a thought I have as a kid. I want some chocolate. And I literally just had a moment of going, well, who's I? That first sense of awareness.
How old were you?
I don't remember. 6, 7, 8.
Oh wow, single
like
digits, okay.
Of just taking a moment to even question, well, what's this I thing? Before that, I think as a kid we're all like the sum of the hydra of our family. We're in this kind of organism, and it's a we, And then there's this moment where the individuation begins. This, I would like this, or no, I don't want that. And we certainly say it loudly to our parents. But then there was that moment where I just went, well, what is that? Where does that begin even, this I? And I think that the inquiry continues 50 years later of, well, what is this I? Is there such a thing? And so trying to understand the boundaries and the liminal, actually, right, that edge between where I begin and where the we ends, and how to play with it. And certainly went through phases of taking this I very seriously, like very important, and then realizing through continued practice that this I is really the sum of a lot of other things, which are the greater we. So there is a person in there, but there's mostly a sensation of a lot of factors that shape who I am. And those factors are environmental, they're social, they're spiritual, they're energetic. There's a host of things, many of which I don't even know. I don't have the knowledge to know what they are, but to try to perceive them. So the inquiry today is try to uh, reach farther and farther in trying to perceive the interconnectedness from the place that I have, which is this crosshair, which is what I think the I is, which is a crosshair of all these concurrent energies and factors that contribute to my perception of life through this angle, as yours does from you. And so the curiosity is to broaden the perception of how far I can feel that.
So the visuals that I have as you're speaking is kind of like an iceberg, right? On the surface is things I'm aware of, and then under the surface is the subconscious. Right? In my mind, that's the visualization, right? And then you can continue to deepen the awareness, go down, go down, go down to see the impact of various influence of environmental, biological, societal, whatever, cultural influence on this idea, this perception of the I, right? So tactically speaking, I want to make sure that people can, if they want to take this on, what are some of the things that they can try on to uncouple these different layers of influence on this concept, this of I?
Well, there's different practices out there, and I've pursued some of them with various degrees of dedication, and then eventually I crafted my own that I felt was better suited to me. I've learned a lot. Mostly, it said my main teacher is nature, and observing, looking at nature, and taking it to as a metaphor for what I believe is we're just another aspect of the ecosystem. Humans are just another aspect of the ecosystem. And so in trying to understand similarities and parallels, I've tried to better understand how I exist within this ecosystem. So a little way that I describe it is that if I look at an oak tree, one of my favorite beings, if you will, life forms, when we see an oak tree, and if you and I sit in a meadow and we point to an oak tree, what we're really doing is we're linguistically calling it something, we're objectifying, we're creating a line of delineation, a boundary, and pointing to that boundary and saying this is an oak tree.
Right.
And it's very convenient because then I could tell you, well, let's meet under the oak tree tomorrow. So it's a convention that allows us to go, well, now we know what we're talking about. But, and it's practical, but it's very reductive. Because actually when we're seeing an oak tree, what eventually biologists have come to understand is that we're seeing a process. We're seeing the result of a host of conditions. The oak tree is really the evidence of many, many, many factors. Some of them are the microbiology of the soil, some of it is the wind, the rain, even the pseudo-accident of the kernel of the oak that rolled and then the animal stepped on it and put it just under the soil just in time for it to burgeon. No, it's not just a thing, it's actually a process, and it continues being a process through photosynthesis. And it's in relation with all the other beings of the forest. It feeds off of the nutrients that fall on its soil through, say, an animal pooping or dying, and yet it also feeds those same animals through creating leaves and oak kernels. So what we're seeing is a little micro version of a much greater ecosystem. And I've started to perceive myself as that oak tree. So rather than look at my delineated shape and say, well, I'm David, which is true, it's an accurate thing, and it's nice to be able to introduce myself to you as you introduce yourself to me. I've come to try to perceive, how do I fit in this forest? What are all the factors that contribute to my beingness that I could become more and more aware of? And that's true of my thoughts just as much as my body. It's, I'm a process. I'm less of a thing than a becoming.
So if I'm hearing you right, looking at different aspects. So whether it be things on the atomic level, to the cellular level, to the molecular level, to the organism level, as well as the cultural level, this entity in relation to other beings, as well as what's happening internally inside your head. Like, so you look at various aspects as a way to help uncouple the various layers of influence on you. Is that accurate?
But it's not necessarily an attempt to uncouple. It's comes from a standpoint of wanting to understand them and take them into consideration. So let's say that I have a desire to do this or do that. One might even call it an inspiration or a wish or a will or whatever that may be. It's interesting to consider, well, why do I even have that desire? Where does it come from? And it's not necessarily necessary to life. We don't need to ask ourselves that question, but I find it interesting to sit in that question of what is even driving my motivation to be a musician, to be a partner, to be a friend, and through this inquiry I found that a lot of these things that I used to take credit for, that I thought was the sum of my beingness, my individuated I, is actually the sum of a host of conditions that have informed me. And there's a greater intelligence that's playing itself through me and shows up in the form of choices or wants and desires, and drives my path, if you will, forward. And, you asked me what the common denominator was earlier, and I think fundamentally the common denominator that I thrive on mostly is the opposite of what most people seek, which is insatisfaction.
Say more about that.
Well, we live in a culture which is always very much these days aspiring to and promising this idea of achieving with the end goal of being satisfied with the achievement.
Right. If you achieve this, you will be happy, satisfied, whatever. Yeah.
And with this promise that once you are satisfied, everything is great. And not to say that satisfaction isn't pleasurable, it is. But it's a little bit like the answer to the question. Once you've answered the question, once you've gotten the satisfaction, the drive recedes. The drive that got you to even hope to achieve that goal. Right? And I think what drives pretty much the entire program for me is that I make peace with being eternally unsatisfied. And this sense of restlessness that is nearly akin to a form of discomfort is very inspiring to me, because it drives me to, no matter how many pieces of music I write, I'm never really satisfied. I want to write another one. And it used to be something I struggled with, whereas now it's become something I'm good friends with. I've reconciled myself with this idea that this sense of insatisfaction is effectively the thing that drives me to achieve more things and discover more things.
Interesting. So instead of looking for that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, as an example, you learn to accept that, hey, this is part of this drive, as you call it, as part of the human condition.
I think it's part of the even biological condition.
Biological condition.
Yeah. There's a lot of certainly some very worthy practices that teach us acceptance and invite us into feeling a sense of wholeness and contentment and serendipity. Beautiful practices. And certainly worth exploring those as tools. But fundamentally, life needs stuff. It's contrary, effectively, to life to think that we don't need things, because at the very simplest idea, you need air, you need water, you need food. So reconciling yourself with those basic needs is fundamental to even your homeostasis. And then later you need company. Now, it's good to learn how to be by yourself. I think it's really valid practice to learn to free yourself as much from maybe the neuroses that comes from having to reconcile with that need. But eventually it's also good to integrate the full breadth of the human experience and maybe use those desires and steer them in the right direction And that's mostly what I do. I have this like literally insatiable desire, but instead of ever hoping to satiate it, I've just learned to point it in certain directions. So I point it towards mostly music, but other things too, philosophy and painting at times, writing at others.
That's a really interesting point of view, which, I mean, you're speaking to the choir. I definitely appreciate that point of view as well. But let's actually unpack that a little bit, because some people's point of view, let's say the aesthetics, right? These people basically try to deprive themselves from food, water, even just the basic needs, shelter, as a way to find that contentment that way. Train their mind. Say, hey, you're my mind. You don't run me, I run you. So even though the body wants sustenance, the mind goes, no. You're gonna deprive yourself of love, of a connection, of food, even water, and all these other things. That's as a way for them to, quote unquote, transcend their body and their mind that way. Versus my understanding of what you're saying is finding acceptance to this human desire, the body, the mind, all of the conditions, and as a way to just point towards the lifestyle they want. Do I have your understanding accurately?
Yeah, and I don't mean to dismiss many different paths out there. There's some beautiful ascetic paths. The path of renunciation is found in different cultures. And I think there's a lot of value to this. You even see small, symbolic versions of it through fasting. In certain cultures, you fast for a day, a month, or a month, a year. The idea of pilgrimage is found in a lot of cultures. Vipassana, the idea of denying yourself even sound for a while. They're all beautiful practices in trying to tame and learn also our edges of comfort and go past them and learn to work with what we have, which is at first a little bit rough around the edges and a bit confused. When we're young and there's a lot of things coming through us, hormones and all sorts of things. And so there's a certain, some of these paths are really valid. And if anybody is drawn towards them, I really applaud them for finding that which is true to them.
Right.
So I don't mean to at all imply that my way is better or their way is better. It's just a different approach. I've tried a few of these paths. I did some interesting tests when I was young, experiments on myself. I spent a few weeks in total absence of light. I boarded all the windows in my loft and spent about a month with no clocks, no watches, and no light. I organized it ahead of time. I've tried to deprive myself like sensory deprivations just to see what happens to my psyche when I do that. I've done a lot of fasting.
So before you go on to that, so what happened to your psyche when you tried that experiment?
Well, you learn to reorient with a different set of conditions. So you remove a sense, and so it doesn't mean you don't orient yourself. You just orient yourself differently, and thus your consciousness is informed in a different way. The way you think, the way you approach is the sum of a different set of conditions. And again, no less valid, no more valid, just different. And that's where it becomes interesting to play with some of these modalities, is to explore actually how flexible the mind is and the perception is. And through that, for at least for me, what it's shown me over time is that this attachment to I am the kind of person who does this, or I am that, or I am this, or I am that, becomes less and less of a hold on me. I become more adaptive and less maybe righteous about my opinion, precisely because I've come to believe that my opinion is the result of a lot of things outside my control, and if you change a few conditions, my opinion, as in how it's formed by my mind, will look at things differently. All I have to do is change the conditions. So I don't have to be so adamant about my opinion, or even judge somebody for theirs. Like I notice sometimes if somebody expresses an opinion that I find challenging, that instead of judging it, all I have to do is consider that the way they came to that conclusion is simply the result of a completely different set of conditions.
Right.
And that were I in that set of conditions, I most likely would end up with the same conclusions.
Right.
However reprehensible I might think they are from my angle.
Correct.
You know.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a way to also be more at peace with what presents itself.
Mm. So, what are some of the other radical, or not so radical experiments you've experimented?
Well, I think the most radical thing that I've ever done was sleep deprivation as a means of experimenting with mind altering without substances. I had my share of mind altering substances when I was young, and I went through a decade of sobriety, of kind of recovering from some of my the challenges of my youth, shall we say. And during that decade, I was still curious about altering my mind, but without the use of external agents. And so depriving myself of light was an interesting one. Depriving myself of sleep was another attempt. So I think
what happened there?
It's not to be recommended. You should not try not to sleep for 5 days.
What happened? Really, kind of.
You get into a psychedelic state. Yeah. After about the third day, there's a state of altered perception, not unlike that of potent psychedelics. I think again, if you look throughout the world, humans have always been curious about altering their way of perceiving things. So in certain cultures, they do it through body modification or scarification, flagellation, fasting, going in a cave for 10 years, sitting cross-legged in strange pretzel positions. You know, they're all ways of transcending the default, our own individual default perception. And challenging it. And so that's all that these things do. They allow you to realize how flexible your perception is and start to broaden your understanding. Or not understanding, perception at least. Understanding maybe comes later.
So if that's the case, why didn't you recommend it? This sleep deprivation?
Oh, health issues.
Oh, health issues?
Yeah, it's dangerous actually.
Oh,
yeah.
In what way was it dangerous?
Well, because you can die from it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, if you deprive any creature from too much sleep, after a few days, their metabolism shuts down, and they can have a heart attack.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
please don't try this at home.
don't try this at home.
Yeah, for sure. That's interesting. So, because you mentioned a few points. So let me ask you this: how do you navigate? Because let's say you do a series of experiments, you experience some peak experience of some sort. Develop some awareness of, hey, I can perceive this reality we call life this way or that way. Then how do you navigate, I guess, with the word that's coming to mind is like healthy, unhealthy, right? Way to look at this or continue this path based on this thinking, etc., etc.
Like, why do I pursue one over another, you mean?
How do you adjust the lifestyle a few degrees over because it's healthier, or it continues to guide you? Like what kind of metrics, internal metrics, do you use as a way to help guide you to run your next experiment, to reinforce certain things, one way or the other?
Functionality.
Say more about that, please.
Well, I think there's some paths that are less functional than others. So if I wanted, at the time, let's say 30 years ago, when I was really focusing on my career as a composer and musician in commercial media, locking myself up in a cave would not have been very functional, since I wouldn't have had the opportunity to meet producers and filmmakers and musicians and things like that. So functionality is a very simple factor, and there we go to there's a cornerstone of not a cornerstone. Sorry, let me back up. There's a choice to be made in what drives us. One is the quest for pleasure, which could be equated with success. Let's say success brings us pleasure, joy, and they're beautiful motivators, these motivators. And then there's another motivator, which is fulfillment. Now, fulfillment doesn't necessarily come with joy or even pleasure, but it's a different motivator for choices that one makes with life. And I've always been more motivated by fulfillment than joy.
Can you say a little bit more about fulfillment? How would you define that?
Well, fulfillment to me is the result of more of an existential acquisition. It's whereas joy tends to be transitory, which is why we seek another reason to feel joyous. So let's say, I like chocolate, and if I eat chocolate, I'll
Give me
feel
positive emotions after I eat this chocolate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, but in order to feel that, I'll have to eat more chocolate.
Right.
Right. As soon as I'm not eating chocolate, that joy is.
Right.
I might have a sweet memory of yesterday's chocolate for a little while, but it's not going to last long. So I'm going to look for more.
Transient. Right.
Whereas, let's say you do something kind for someone, or you do an objective that, like you acquire a skill. You read a really, really beautiful book that changes you, that enriches you in some way, and you've put in the effort to read the 1,000 pages and really get deep into it. That stays with you for the rest of your life. Now, it may not have been as fun. You might read a book that's really heady, and you have to look up a lot of definitions in the dictionary and really read some of these paragraphs a few times to really get to the heart of it. So it may not be fun or pleasurable. You may not derive joy from it, but you derive at the end a sense of fulfillment that I think stays with you longer and becomes, that's why I call it more of an existential thing. It carves and shapes you, your beingness in a way that is more long-lasting. At least for me, that's how I perceive it.
Right. So you use the internal metrics of fulfillment as a way to guide you towards different experiments. Is that an accurate way to recap what you just said?
When you were asking me how do I choose one path versus another, and why would I favor one versus another?
Correct.
And I said, well, it goes to functionality. And so is it functionally contributing to that sense of fulfillment? Or is it simply giving me a delightful sense of joy and pleasure? And not that I deny myself pleasure, I just don't let it define the majority of the time I spend. I spend the majority of the time seeking fulfillment, and then sometimes seeking also pleasure. But it's a lesser percentage.
Lesser percentage as you gain more wisdom and age?
No, it always has. Yeah. It always has.
It always has.
Yeah.
I've always, since you were 5 years old, wanted to pursue the path of fulfillment.
No, because at 5 you're not necessarily in charge of your program. Your parents define where you go and what you do.
Sure.
But certainly as a young adult, I realized that there was more to be gained by fulfillment than, for me at least. Again, it's not necessarily something that's not a universal truth. It just happens to work for me better.
Yeah, I mean that's a beautiful gift to have that realization that, when you're a teenager. Because looking back at my own journey, I certainly didn't have that. Right, I was certainly chasing the positive experience. Right, when I was younger, and I think the switch happened when I entered into my mid-20s.
Yeah, that's about right.
Right, and then obviously less and less about the physical pleasure, and more about this internal existential, quest for fulfillment. Okay.
We all have that moment, and I think pretty much everybody would appreciate that. Say you walk on the street and you spot a $20 bill. Or let's say with a $5 bill. It's easier. And you have two choices you can make with it. You're in front of an ice cream parlor, and there's a homeless person sitting outside the ice cream parlor. Right, so here's a clear choice. You can either go and treat yourself to a $5 ice cream, and there's no reason you don't deserve it. You're a nice person, and you feel like ice cream. It's a hot summer day, and there's some really nice ice cream in that ice cream parlor. And surely there's nothing wrong if you choose to do that. It's not immoral. And you walk out and you'll eat your ice cream, and an hour later, that's it. Or you can hand the homeless person the $5 and walk away from the ice cream parlor. What will shape your life more? What will stay with you down the road? And that's it. That's where it comes down to. And
Well,
when you're young, as if you're younger, a kid, well, it's not that they're not caring, but they don't have the comprehension capacities to consider that choice. So they, of course, will take the $5 and get ice cream.
right.
You know,
The impulse.
and when you start getting into your 20s, then you start considering the consequences of your actions.
Yeah, I love that quote from Viktor Frankl, the author of Man's Search for Meaning. He says, between stimulus and response, there's a space, and in that space lies our growth and freedom.
Yeah.
So what I'm hearing is, as you grow older, or acquire more wisdom, rather, the space lengthens. Now you have more and more choice and options, or consideration, rather.
Yeah, you take more and more into consideration.
Yeah.
I shared this little story with you, with the group a couple of nights ago, where I said, you know, if you take a child to a forest, the child will see a lot of green stuff. And then you bring a teenager to the forest and he'll be able to spot trees and shrubs, and then a young adult will know the name of some of the trees and say, oh, that's an oak tree, or pine tree, or cedar. And then you take same person, you know, turns into a biologist, and he goes there and all of a sudden he sees the complexity of an ecosystem. And then you take a historian to that same forest, and now he understands the concepts on a geopolitical level of, you know, what took place for centuries, you know, like, and it's the same forest, and it's not inaccurate to perceive life one way. It's just that there's different lenses of perception on it. And I think as we get older, we just are able to consider more and more factors. And it's normal, it's just part of our maybe neurologically, our brain wires itself to take more and more things into consideration. We have more capacity to comprehend the consequences of our actions because, well, we've gotten hurt and we've hurt others and we felt regret. So now when we act, we take a moment to go, well, will I get hurt or will I hurt someone else? You know, and we've lost things we cared about, so now we're a bit more careful. That's why kids, you know, you give them a toy, they'll break it. You give an adult something of value, they will care for it. It's not that the kid is a worse person than the adult, it's just inexperienced and it hasn't learned yet.
That's a very compassionate way to look at it. Okay, so as you get older and acquire more wisdom, the word that you also used earlier is capacity, right? More and more capabilities. And you have the various options, right? So I want to actually segue this into a different conversation. So as you get older, you have more capabilities, more wisdom, more ways to consider things, and also more capacities, more social currencies as well. How do you choose the projects that you take on? Because you can go write another screenplay, learn another song, learn another instrument, or give all your resources to a homeless person. Where all of them may give you various degrees of fulfillment, let's say. 1,000 choices. Which one do you pick? How do you pick? How do you make your choices?
Well, first I want to back up for a moment because I don't know that necessarily. I'm very careful with the use of the word wisdom. That's why I refer to functionalities and capacities and things like this, just because it's a little bit more neutral.
Okay.
If somebody feels compelled to call me wise, I'll take the compliment, but I don't know that I'm wise. I'm just trying to figure things out like everybody else. There's a certain amount of capacities that I realize I have more ease at, just from repetition. You know, the more we do something, the more comfortable it becomes.
Well, I may call that wisdom. What's your definition of wisdom?
No, it's possible. No, I don't have one.
Okay, got it.
So, as far as what determines my choices, well, I'm kind of a bit of a conundrum. Not conundrum, but I'm in a phase of my life where things are changing. The motivations of my younger life have less of a hold on me, and yet I can't necessarily admit that I've settled into this next phase. I've definitely felt a shift in the last few years, and I'm not ageist. I feel very young and kind of ageless in one way, and yet there is still a bell curve to life. there's an inevitability to mortality, and it shapes also the way we think and perceive life. Not from an alarmist standpoint, just I welcome it. I'm really glad I'm becoming who I am becoming. It gets better every year, hopefully. To me it does.
Right.
And yet I'm relearning, I'm having to relearn in a way as I become this new version of who I thought I was, what will motivate my choices. So I have the motivations of my 20s are very different in my 30s, 40s, and now I'm entering my 50s. I would say that what motivates me today may be different for sure than in 10 years, but right now...
You might concretize that? Like what motivated you in 20s and 30s and 40s and now 50s? Just so that people can feel a little more relatedness?
I mean, and this is just applied to me, it's not necessarily universal, but I think in my 20s a lot of neuroses drove me, insecurities. Insecurity is a great motivator for achievement, having to try to prove things to myself or my parents or my peers, the imposter syndrome, all these things that drove me nuts, but also drove me to practice 10, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, things like that were great motivators. And then eventually I became confident enough to go, okay, well, I'm becoming decent at this. I don't need to be neurotic about it. But then the motivation in my 30s then is probably more wanting status and success and economic wealth, and what this generation these days calls abundance, manifesting abundance. Right? We didn't have that then, but same idea of wanting basically stuff for self, and external evidence of one's worth. In the form of a big house or a car, cool clothes, in my case many instruments. And then in my 40s there's definitely realization that that program has run its course, and that I no longer was willing to let that program guide the majority of my choices. So became more interested again in say more philosophical inquiry, like start to cultivate more of an inner life, the realization that actually all this stuff is just stuff, and it's not necessarily going to be here forever. It's not as fulfilling as other practices. I'd say my 40s were more was the beginning of this change, of walking away from that, what some people call the rat race of achievement, of valuing oneself against the quote-unquote evidence of success, as determined by this Occidental culture, or this more capitalist system. And it led me to change my life and find myself in a ranch in the mountains where you and I are right now. And now that I'm here, I'm curious as to what will happen in my 50s.
So you haven't had as crisp of a definition, or just, what's the word I'm looking for, like a pursuit of X, you so articulately said earlier.
I'm less and less interested in pursuing X. So a big shift, I would say, that's taken place in the last decade of my life is to change the main source of my motivation from what to how. We talked about this the other night, no?
Say more about that, please.
And so it's a distinction. A lot of our culture focuses and invites us to focus on what we hope to achieve, what we hope to accomplish, what we hope to become, what do you do, what are you. The predominant focal point is on the what, and it's been a gradual process, but the last 10 years I've put that question aside and concerned myself more and more with the how. How will I achieve? How will I walk? How will I talk? How will I be? and trust that the what will be informed by the how rather than the other way around. And because over the course of my experience in life, I've come to realize that what I am left with at the end of any experience, if it's short-lived or long-lived, it could be a short project or a long relationship, or it can be the duration of an afternoon, going to a park, or it can be a vacation, or writing an album, or producing a soundtrack, or getting married, and whatever. That what I'm left with at the end of these chapters is far more determined by how I approached each of these things than what I approached. And so I focus more on the how these days.
So what would be an example of how?
Well, how is not that mysterious. It's, there's some hows that I happen to favor, such as kindly, gently, compassionately, patiently, politely, inspired. They're just simple ideas. So I let that guide my actions more than what I choose to do.
Why did you pick those out of infinite number of possibilities?
Because over the course of my life, but also I think history, some of these qualities keep coming back in the writings of some worthy teachers, and they are useful tools with which to have a decent life, actually. Because in the end, that's all we're here to do. We're here for a finite amount of time, and yes, it's cool to achieve this or acquire that and prove ourselves that we can do this and we can do that. But in the end, it's really how we feel about our life and how we have affected others when they feel. I think it's a Maya Angelou quote who says, people remember how you made them feel, something along those lines. And it's something that stuck with me, and that stays with me. It's like, what impact do I have on myself and others more than what have I done? And what impact is determined by how I did things.
So question for you there. So I'm very human, right? Just like, and there's aspirations of the how I wanted to maintain. Be more patient, compassionate, loving, all these things. Right? Then there's the moment where I'm being tested, right? Someone may say something that triggers whatever, then I find myself losing my patience, losing my cool, right? All that calmness that I gather from meditation evaporates
instantly. Yeah.
And the true test is of, hey, you say you want to be more patient, boom, right there, right? So so I'm curious to know your point of view. How do you maintain that groundedness in that moment?
But I don't.
You don't?
No, I'm just as human as you. So the short answer is, I'm not perfect, no one is. There's not a single human on this planet that doesn't have a capacity for losing their temper, and challenge them long enough. Even the Dalai Lama, I'm sure, can get miffed. It's okay.
So you don't try to control it, you just go with it?
No, it's a practice. As in, yes, there's some things that I would like to, that I work on, but not from the place of beating myself up, just a place of learning the lesson. So we have some really wonderful, intelligent mechanisms. We don't even have to practice them. Regret and remorse is a delightful teacher in pointing out that you could do better. Right? You say you have a moment, altercation with somebody or conversation that doesn't go the way you hoped, and your reaction is to be short and snappy or rude or even mean. At that moment, you lost your cool. Well, if majority of people have enough morals that within a day or two, they'll go, oh, I kind of feel bad about that. Like we know when we've done something wrong, and it shows up as remorse or regret or guilt in some cases. And those are the moments to commit ourselves to approaching it in a better way. It's a flag. It's like a little mini trauma. No? It reminds us, oh, okay, I'll be careful next time. And they happen all the time. Like, we learn how to not burn ourselves by burning ourselves a little bit. You know? Like, we put our hand on the stove a little bit, hopefully, and go, ooh, okay, so that's what he does to me in small amounts. And you do it only twice, 3 times. After that, you know not to do it. So it's the same way, I think. We learn by listening to this process. And having patience, it's going to happen by one way or another. I was telling you the other day, like, patience happens one way or another, whether you...
Yeah, no, this is actually really great. If you don't mind sharing that publicly on this podcast, so I think that was really valuable.
Which one?
Patience happens regardless.
Oh, yeah. For some of us who were predisposed to being impatient, and it's not necessarily, you don't even have to practice at becoming patient. You will become patient one way or another, because life literally gets it out of you. There's going to be inevitably things that only time reveals to you. No matter what effort you think you can put towards it, you can't speed it up. And one of them is wisdom, one of them is becoming. You become one day at a time. It's nothing, you can't escape that one.
That's actually interesting, what you just said, you can't speed it up. Because in my mind, I wanted to believe, right, with my daily meditation practice or contemplative studies, philosophical conversation with friends, I could somehow, not necessarily speed it up, but catalyze, to bring that awareness more and more and more. So, but your point of view is it's gonna take 9 months to have a baby, and that's just how it's gonna be, and no amount of daily practice, whatever, it's gonna help cultivate this patience.
No, it's not that it doesn't help something, but it's not necessary. It's a bit like this. If you look at the ocean, on top of the ocean, you might see waves and ripples, and if there's a breeze, let's say it'll splash a bit of water, there'll be some foam, all sorts of activities. And if you go and you splash at the top of the ocean, or if you drive a boat through it, you will make some visible marks, some lines, no? But what's actually really happening underneath is the tides. The entire ocean is moving to the left and to the right in ways that is way more fundamental to what's going on, actually, than the little splashing of the waves that happens on top. I think a lot of what we do when we're attempting these quote-unquote hacks is we're splashing around on the top of the ocean. What's actually really happening to you is the tides. The entire sum of the ocean is moving at its own pace, and you're just residing on the top surface, playing with the top surface of the water. The way life unfolds through us is like the tides. It's not escapable, and it's way more fundamental, as in it's the foundation upon which all these entertaining activities take place, such as, oh, I'm going to get into spiritualism, or maybe brain hacks, or I'm going to try to meditate, and it's great. There's nothing wrong with doing it. It's on a surface that is rather finite, and is a perfectly fine way to spend time.
I see. So in other words, I want to put words in your mouth, but what I'm hearing is, all right, if this is useful, this is entertaining, this practice, do it, but won't necessarily move the needle per se. It still takes time to develop that patience. Let's use that as a marker.
Yeah, it takes time to become yourself. And it takes time to become, older version of yourself. It literally takes all these years to become older. And one way or another, you can try to hack it all you want. And why would you want to? And it's not to say that some of these practices are not useful sometimes, but most of what they're useful for is giving our kind of what is referred to as our monkey brain something to chew on, so that we don't become too neurotic and confused or anxiety riddled. So it helps relieve anxiety. A lot of these practices, like meditation, are there to really help you be okay while the big long theme of life unfolds.
Not sure I like what I hear.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, but
And again, this is just my own personal experience.
yeah, of course, of course. And but precisely, to me, worthy. This is the way I kind of look at worthy conversations.
Mm-hmm.
That I walk away with something to chew on
Mm-hmm.
versus something that I've already heard.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, okay, so segue a little bit more. I see in your house 200 instruments,
Mm-hmm.
and the level of mastery that you have on these instruments is just, just astounding. Because I, by myself, having hard enough time to practice one. You do 200.
Mm-hmm.
So, for those of us that's not well versed, skill in music or instruments, what mental models do you have for someone who aspires to play an instrument? Because here's actually the story that I hear a lot from people. I used to play music when I was young. I don't because X, Y, and Z. I am afraid to pick it up again. So there's a mental block there that stops them from even picking it up again. To have the courage to jump back into the world of the unknown. So what mental shift as well as tactical practice that they can take on to enjoy this beautiful thing called playing music?
Well, for one thing, I don't necessarily know that it takes courage. That word is starting to become so overused that it's losing its initial meaning.
Okay.
What we're seeing is a little bit of a time in our culture which is focused on instant gratification, and where we want fast results. We like, say, the conveniences of all our digital gadgetry. I can text you, I expect a reply back, and you want to text me back quickly, so you put an emoji. So this idea of instant gratification.
Guilty as charged.
We all do it,
yeah,
of course. And so we're starting to lose, or forget, not lose, but it's a temporary, maybe, amnesia, that there's the value of reward to effort. And so when I meet people who have the same discourse with me, I used to play a little bit of this, a bit of that. Most what I detect is people who simply just were not encouraged to get past the initial discomfort, because we are monkey see, monkey do. Mirror receptors. We are part of a time in history where we see instant gratification at the click of a mouse. And so if we pick up an instrument and it requires, say, 1,000 hours, not 10,000, but just even 500 hours, before we become even halfway decent at it, majority of people just give up after 30 hours, or even sometimes 10 hours.
Guilty as charged.
Yeah. And there was, I think, a different time when there was a little bit more value on self-discipline. As a measure of a good life. This ability to discipline oneself, which wasn't always self-discipline, sometimes it was imposed discipline. In some cultures, in some older tradition, there's a much more demands placed even on the young people, etc., to live up to a certain code of behavior. Which in our Western civilization we feel like we've liberated ourselves from it. The shackles of traditionalism have been lifted, and now it's the time for individual expression, which is beautiful on one end, but it has forgotten in the process that these old traditions emerged over the course of centuries to help us acquire skills which are not instantly gratifying in some cases, but are very useful in the long run, or fulfilling. We're back to this idea. They're fulfilling. So if I have any suggestion is have patience and be committed. It's about commitment. We're also living in a time where this notion of commitment is very subjective, shall we say. And you see that in relationships.
What's your definition of commitment?
don't necessarily know that I have a precise one. A commitment is a wow, I'm stumped. A commitment is a commitment. I'm sorry. Wow, I love the question. Thank you. It's great. What is my definition of commitment? Okay, so this is my definition of commitment. I do have one.
Great.
It's a willingness to surrender fully. If not fully, at least the necessary part of yourself to what you're committing to. And so it doesn't matter if it's a relationship, a person, or if it is an art form, or if it is a philosophical principle, a political ideology, a career path. When you commit to it, it's not you doing something to it, it's you allowing that thing to come inside you and guide your actions. And
the willingness
to give yourself up to it. You actually give yourself to it. It's a relinquishing. It is a form of self-abnegation in service to something that you believe is a good vehicle for a worthy vehicle for your experience. And once you do that, then you're not in question. Then there's no effort per se, although some of it can feel like an effort. You're doing stuff, but it is. It feels very natural.
Yeah, you mentioned a few interesting points. I want to follow up. You mentioned feel. You mentioned surrendering to this. I think the word used is choice or decisions or something like that. But in a world where there's infinite possibilities, where one could make tons of different options, right? Take different options, it's easy to feel like, well, maybe I shouldn't have picked the guitar. Maybe the what would be the smaller one, the ukulele would be easier. Or maybe the ukulele is not it. Maybe it's let me pick another instrument. Maybe the mouth harp or whatever. Right? The didgeridoo, right? It's easier. So, how do you discern which path to pick?
Is the question specifically related to picking an instrument? Or
I think, so in my mind, everything is translatable, right? It could be starting a business. Should I start business A, business B? Should I pick a partner, partner A, partner B? Instrument A, B, C. And chances are it's more than one, right? Because as they say, if you go on Tinder, 1,000 choices, right? Oh, this is too challenging. Swipe left. Went on 2 dates. You didn't have this or that and the other thing. Swipe left. In the days where we're inundated by choice, it's, I would assert, harder to surrender to this commitment, because I may be committed to have a good relationship, but now you have inundated with choice. Like, maybe I could optimize my chance for success to reach this thing if I...
Okay, so the first, I'll start my answer at the end of your question.
Sure.
Success is a much flaunted word these days. And the matrix by which we determine success is very subjective, although these days it's economic, it's outward signs of happiness, which often we find out later were not necessarily commensurate with what was going on in the inner life. You see somebody who looks very wealthy, happy, married, and you find out they committed suicide. So there's things like this. So, and yet we gauge our success based on comparing our own outward manifestation to their own outward manifestation. It's a game of comparison. Success is subjective. It's a race. But that means there has to be losers and winners. So I just invite you to first consider how useful this notion of seeking success actually is. And I'm not saying it's not useful in a certain source of motivation, and motivation is a good driving agent, but you can choose what you are motivated by. It's good to be motivated, period. I do believe that. But there comes a point where you can become more selective as to what you wish to be motivated by. And the motivation for success is not necessarily a bad one, but it's not necessarily the only one that you can drive yourself. Fundamentally, what do you want your life to be defined by is a more interesting question. How do you want? Who would you like to become in life? Is an interesting inquiry. It's worth considering. It's worth listening to that voice, and that voice is found in silence, away from comparative mediums such as social media, television, other people. It's really found in those states of isolation and meditation and silence, where you actually get to reconnect with that little spark that makes you you. Having said that, I go back to an earlier answer when you say, do you swipe left or do you swipe right? At some point you realize it has nothing to do with who you're swiping towards. It has to do with how you're going to show up in any relationship that will determine the outcome of your relationship. And we know this because there's evidence, plenty of it, of people in certain cultures where their marriages are arranged, who confess after 30, 40, 50 years of these marriages that they have some of the best relationships we have come to know. And they were not given the opportunity to swipe left or swipe right and pick on probabilities of success. But they were supported by some of these cultures, not all of them. I'm not making a big generalization, I'm using this as an idea, that some of these cultures assisted these people in the how. And the how being more patient, more understanding, less self, more in service to the whole, to the family, to the culture, to society. That's what allows these people to feel really content in their later years. Doing things which, to our gauge, and by ours I mean the Western model here in America today, would seem not successful. It does not look like success. I've seen people live very simple lives. I've traveled a lot and gotten to meet a lot of people because I'm a musician, and it's a great passport to have an instrument. It opens all these doors. So I get invited to all sorts of different socioeconomic brackets. I've met rich people, poor people, simple people. They're all beautiful, all amazing people. And I found it's really interesting to see how often people whose life from the outside looks very simple are actually far more content than the people who have achieved quote-unquote success by our Western measure.
Now, is that translatable to selecting a musical instrument?
Yes, because in the end it's not about the instrument, it's about how will you play the instrument, will you dedicate yourself to it?
Especially your first one.
Will you care for it? Will you practice it? Will you commit yourself to being in this conversation with this instrument long enough to get somewhere? Are you just going to chit-chat with it? Are you just going to go on that first date and go, swipe left, another one, first date, swipe left? All first dates fundamentally are not going to be very deep and rich.
First date is always interesting.
It's interesting.
Yeah, because you get new things to talk about. It's a new instrument, right?
It's titillating.
New sounds. But it does take.
But the deeper questions that enrich our lives in a relationship really come through time. They come through facing our fears. They come through facing our vulnerabilities and being willing to reveal those to one another. And that takes time. That's not on the first date. You don't swipe left or right to do that. You have to commit yourself to that conversation, I think. That inquiry.
I heard you say this in passing, and I wanted to bring it up. You had mentioned that, this instrument is fine. It's very peaceful. It's not very needy. So you almost personify your instrument as a relationship that you cultivated, so that you don't need to cultivate or pay attention to and practice as often as, based on the requirement of the instruments. Is that an accurate comparison to?
Yes, I know. I mean, I did say that probably in passing in the context of a party. So to correct the record, I own 200 instruments. I don't actively play 200 instruments, and I'm definitely not a master at many of them that I have here. I practice on a lot of them, but the rest are part of a collection that I've recorded and I work on periodically. I pull one out and I'll dive into it for a few months, and some more than others. And there are some instruments that are close enough to another instrument. Say, I can go from a piano to an organ. Obviously, I don't have to practice the organ because it's the same sort of instrument. It has the same ergonomics. So if I practice piano, I can once in a while sit at an organ and sound pretty good. Although if everybody wants to be an organist, I should practice the organ. But I can get away with being a pianist on an organ. And I can go from a guitar to maybe an oud, and vice versa. So sometimes I do neglect one of them because it's in a family close enough that when I get back to it, we're not starting from scratch.
So I want to segue to a theme of mastery. What would you say you're a master of?
Oh, I would never say that I'm a master of anything.
Well, I know you would never. But if one were to inquire that question, what would be the intuitive answer that comes to mind?
No, I mean, really my answer is it's not for me to determine. It's for others to determine if I'm a master of anything. I'm a student. I'm a perpetual curious. And I'm not saying this as a false modesty. I am aiming. I would like to reach a state of mastery to something in my life. It doesn't have to be music. It could be anything. And I think that others will inform me as to whether I gotten there or not. It's not my own gauge.
How would you know? Was it winning some awards of some kind?
I don't know that
of something?
I don't know that I need to know. I don't necessarily care, actually. I like the quest. I know my relationship to mastery is like this. I've seen it. I've been in the presence of it, and I've certainly experienced it as a listener, as an audience of different art forms as well as sports. I've definitely experienced mastery, and it's a really the way I've come to perceive it is that if you take any craft or skill, it doesn't matter, at first there is a disposition. You might see in a kid, oh, he's got some musical disposition, or maybe he's drawing really well, or he's throwing balls really well in a hoop, and you're like, oh well, he has disposition with it, and then eventually that, if cultivated a little bit, can show up as talent. And talent is really cool. Talent is the encouragement where something feels easier for that kid versus another activity, or that activity to another kid. It's a place where maybe there's a form of inner encouragement from this natural disposition that shows up as talent, and then through a bit of effort and discipline, and again the cultivation of the parents or society or whatever, how it works out, then it shows up as skill, and then eventually it shows up as accomplishment, and then we start to become aware of it as an audience when we start going.
Sorry, pause for a second. Accomplishments and recognition by others, and win some awards of some sort, and this and that.
Even just an applause, whether it's an award or not.
Some feedback loop.
Yeah, some feedback. Even if it's of the self, even if you're by yourself, you at some point recognize that there's, oh my God, this actually is really cool.
It's pretty good.
It's pretty good, yeah. And there's that point where, and now I'm going to go back to the perspective of the audience. I've sat in many, many concerts, of course, and there's that moment where an artist is really, really impressive, where they are wowing us, right? And that, of course, I would say makes up a certain percentage of people, certain percentage of these artists. But they don't all give us a sense of mastery. Mastery is, in my belief, it's that last 3%. It's ineffable. It's really hard to even define what it is. We can be impressed by great skill, but we are awed by mastery. Mastery gives us a sense of awe that transcends the person, that is actually doing it.
Mm-hmm.
They are obviously doing it, but they nearly disappear. They become a vehicle for this moment that is being witnessed at that moment. And it can be in a painting, it can be in a music, it can be in all sorts of things. It's a sort of visitation.
Visitation.
Possibly, because it's temporal, like even great masters are not always masterful.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I've seen concerts from the same musician where there'll be that moment of mastery, and then the next time it's still really impressive, but it's not masterful. And it's elusive. It's that last, you know, that little bit. Yeah, it's the X factor. We don't really know why. You can see an athlete run every day, and then at one moment he breaks the world record. And there's something that happened at that moment. It's a host of conditions.
Okay, so let me ask you this: follow up, right? As an artist, in the musical form, as a writer, there's a saying that, hey, I get to be, I'm butchering the quote, but I get to be inspired every day at 9 o'clock on my seat. So the way they, to help cultivate that environment for the visitation is by that discipline of sweeping their temple every day at 9 o'clock by sitting in the seat, etc.
Okay.
What are some of the maybe rituals that you have as a way to sweep your temple, to allow, to help with that visitation by Elizabeth calls it the muse, right? The visitation, as you said. I don't know how you name that entity, but how would you cultivate that?
I'll just call it inspiration.
Inspiration, okay.
For now. And yes, I am a big fan of a Russian composer called Igor Stravinsky, who wrote a really important work back in the 20th century called The Rite of Spring. And it's one of the pieces of music that really inspired me when I was young, and I studied a lot. And in his autobiography, which I read when I was 16, 17 years old, he said that he wrote every day of his life 8 bars a day, no matter what, just as an exercise. And it didn't matter if he was inspired or not, he would just sit down every day and write 8 measures. So at the very minimum, it was a little bit like a workout, if you will. You know, every day he at least ran his 2 miles. You know, and so that when the moment of inspiration would strike him, he would not be rusty. Right? And so I took that to heart, and I did that for many, many, many years. I every day wrote 8 measures a day.
You did?
Yeah, I did.
Amazing.
Yeah, for many years. And I wrote literally books, a lot of notebooks full of these 8-measure themes, ideas, sometimes a counterpoint, sometimes a chord progression. Didn't matter. And what turns out to be is, the reason why it was really valuable is that I never stopped at 8 bars. But the goal was not so high that I wouldn't, you know, if I told myself every day I will write 3 hours a day, I may not have done it. But by 8 bars you can write in 15 minutes. By doing it, by having that minimum, I pretty much always sat for 2 hours. And I always wrote more than 8 bars, you know. So I don't do that as religiously as I did then.
Yeah, why?
Just because I write every day, I don't need to give myself that 8 bar.
It's now so much of a habit is now arbitrary. Is that?
Yeah, just part of it. It's like I breathe every day. I don't give myself breathing exercises.
Right. Yeah, good point.
So as far as my ritual, yeah, pretty much every night when everybody has gone to sleep, I'm a nocturnal being, and I will sit, even if it's 2 in the morning, and sit at the piano for at least what is supposed to be an hour, works out to pretty much always being 2 or 3 or 4. So I write every day. That's my practice.
Now let me ask you this: is that a specific rituals for as a composer, or just musician? Period.
Both, because I only play what I write.
Got it. So it's a multiplier. It hits multiple points, stack.
Well, I'm only a musician by necessity. Meaning I'm a composer by trade, and that's what I like doing. I like creating music, but a lot of the stuff that I do when I first started writing for some of these exotic instruments, I just couldn't meet musicians who played these weird instruments that I collect. So I learned how to play the music that I was writing because there was nobody around to play it. So it started as a necessity, and then it became something I like doing. Of course, I'm also a musician, but for many years I didn't identify as a musician. I identified as a composer. And I would correct people if they introduced me, oh, meet David the musician. I'd be like, no, I'm not a musician, I'm a composer. And now I've become equal part. But most of what I compose are exercises for my musicianship. They're etudes, you know. Etude is a study. They're studies. You know, I write pieces that improve my playing.
Oh, your drills?
Yeah, they're drills.
Interesting.
They're studies. I mean, they're studies of many things. They're not just finger exercise studies. Some of them are. Like I have some pieces that I have written to increase my dexterity, but there are some that are the sum of more cognitive studies of harmony or concepts.
So actually, on that note, I'm a amateur. I don't play music. I used to. Right. Yet, correct. I have in the past, and I want to. So what would simple kind of like building blocks? Because I find it to be useful to have. Let me backtrack. Kind of mixing analogy a little bit. You can definitely bake a cake by having the right ingredients with the right sequence. When you do things out of sequence, the cake will come out very, very different, right? So similarly, in my mind, there's building blocks in life in general. So are there certain building blocks, major building blocks, if I wanted to appreciate music more, if I wanted to be a better vocalist or instrumentalist, what are some of the building blocks I should think about in terms of sequence on the road to mastery, per se?
Okay, let me answer that question in a second. Boo Boo, would you please put some more wood in the fireplace before it dies? Thank you. You're in charge back there. It's getting cold. Thanks. Yeah, okay, great. Well, first I would dispense with this idea of reaching for mastery as a goal, because we're back to this idea of success and all that.
Sure. Can't help it. I'm addicted to that idea.
No, it's fine. Yeah. That's why I'm here to lovingly remind you.
I appreciate it. Thank you for the gentle reminder. Yeah.
And yeah, it's corny, but you know, we'll go back to the old saying: "It's not the destination; it's the journey." La di da. You know, there's a reason why that saying has stuck around. It's because really, your life is more pleasant that way. Pick a general heading. Yeah, I mean, it's nice to decide that you want
enjoy the journey.
But if you don't enjoy the journey because you only focus on this end goal, then you've missed the point entirely of life. And it doesn't necessarily mean you need to dilly-dally on your way to it. You can try to expedite getting there. But even if it's fast, enjoy it. Like, no matter what. Because otherwise, because you're never sure that even when you get there, you're going to be happy. I've had that experience of reaching my goal, getting the cherry on the pie and all this, and then realizing I don't like cherries. And it's a very sobering experience after spending a decade trying to achieve something, to achieve it, only to realize that it's not all you thought it would, be, and go.
I can relate.
Go, oh wait, I spent 10 years trying to achieve this, and I sacrificed this, and I gave this up, and I hurt this person, and I hurt myself, and now I have it, and I'm not all that content, So make sure you're content on your way there.
Thank you for that. I definitely relate, for sure.
So to go back to your question, as far as the building blocks, yes, there's some basic ideas. There's two approaches to music, and it depends on one's goal is. People forget that we call it playing music, and that first and foremost it should be something enjoyable and playful, and that for centuries most people played something. We didn't have radios, we didn't have iPods and iPhones and TVs and all that stuff. So we made music with each other, for each other, and for just sheer pleasure, like we did last night. where we played around. Everybody got to play and make a sound. It was very convivial and communal. And
it was very, very inspiring.
Yeah, it was fun, no?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And part of what people do these days is when they pick up an instrument, they instantly compare themselves to a vast amount of mastery that is available for direct listening, streaming. So they feel intimidated. And if you go back through history, there was, of course, really talented, exceptional musicians or other art forms. We'll stick to music for now. Who might travel through your village and once a year might show up. And of course it would be impressive and maybe even intimidating for a moment, but mostly it was inspiring. And then that traveling musician would leave. And then you were left in your village. And you still wanted to hear music, so you might pick up a fiddle or spoons or a banjo, like something. And music was more integrated. The playing, music is in playing, playfully making music was more integrated in our everyday life. So if anything, there's, for a large group of people, I would say just play, just have fun with it. Don't compare your achievements to like virtuoso musicians, because you don't need to be a virtuoso musician, you just need to have fun with it. You have to play with it. Remember that it's meant to be playful, which is true of most of life, by the way, I think. And then if you want to have a career or deepen, once you have that original playfulness with it, if an instrument calls you to a more dedicated path of musicianship, then it's about studying. And there's all sorts of wonderful academic institutions out there that teach composition or one particular instrument, and yeah, just study it through books, online these days. There's so much wonderful material, and then meet other musicians, play with them, be inspired by other people who do it, and join the conversation that is taking place in the evolution of music throughout the ages.
Thanks for that. I'll try to remember that. Right. Just make sure that it's playing music. Play it, have a good time.
Have a good time.
All right, so let me segue to another conversation, which is the start of this podcast. What it means to be a man in modern times.
What it means to be a man in modern times. Can you qualify the question a little bit, because it's so broad?
It is very broad. So why don't we start by, one, is that a worthy question to ask? Right, so going back to the very beginning of this podcast, if you ask a question, you're going to get more interesting inquiries versus arriving to a finite answer. So what's your point of view around the whole idea of masculine and feminine?
Well, there's definitely a beautiful balance that takes place between women and men. I really appreciate the cognitive differences. Like, we think differently, we approach and synthesize information differently in a way that is complementary. I think that we really complement one another, and it's in the design. We're designed to be incomplete. That's why we're driven to pair up. That sense of fulfillment that comes in finding relationships. And that's not necessarily gender specific. It's more energetic. It's the yin and the yang, which can be found also in different versions of genderism. But yeah, there's this lovely balance that takes place with the yin and the yang, and I think that within each of us there is also a balance that is being revealed. And although I'm more masculine than feminine, and I like that, there's still an aspect of my femininity that I cultivated over time, especially in holistic thinking. Men are more linear thinking, which is very effective, and allows us to make certain approach certain tasks in a linear way, and in some cases that's the more functional way, and then there's the holistic, more feminine, which is in some cases really also functional and necessary. And I think that's that balance of those two that I really appreciate. So what it means to be a man to me at this point means first really acknowledging that balance from a place of mutual respect, mutual celebration also, and also the cultivation within myself and my fellow brothers and sisters also, all of our relatives here of this pretty planet, to embody a healthy balance of those two things within self, but not at the expense of what we are fundamentally inclined towards. I'm inclined
Can you roll
towards...
back one sentence? What do you mean by that? I didn't understand. One more time?
Well, meaning that I'm inclined towards being masculine,
Mm.
and just because I want to cultivate my femininity shouldn't be at the expense of my masculine.
you.
There is
Thank you.
definitely a conversation right now that's taking place, which is an important conversation, clearly. Like all conversations, I think if people are preoccupied with something, it's worth listening to, and certainly worth acknowledging those ideas that are being expressed, and yet not at the expense of other ideas. We should be adding to the conversation, not replacing an idea with another. So if we want to cultivate our inner feminine, it shouldn't be at the expense of our inner masculine, and vice versa for the feminine. So being a man today is also about holding that space for self, being okay, being masculine.
So what would be, right, say someone who's listening to this, inspired by your point of view, let's say, so what would be something like concrete that he can take on as a way to cultivate the feminine while maintaining his sovereign masculine?
Repeat the question for me,
Sure.
please. Yeah.
So principally speaking,
Yeah.
what you just said, beautifully said, wholeheartedly agree,
Mm-hmm.
right? What would be a concrete tactic, or like a question one can ask, or a practice one can take on as a way to maintain that healthy, in my mind, healthy balance, a healthy alignment between the inner masculine and the inner feminine?
I think it always comes back to an idea of what's the word? Pardon me. Mindfulness. It goes back to this idea of mindfulness, which is to take things into consideration. To be mindful, to me, at least my definition of it and my version of it, is to consider things outside my immediate experience. To be mindful of you, to be mindful of my partner, my neighbors, the ecosystem, and also mindful of myself. So when it comes up as this idea of the masculine versus the feminine, I think it's important to be mindful of how our actions or our desires, the way we walk into the world, has an impact upon others, and also be mindful about how they have an impact on us, and try to negotiate that with as much elegance and mutual care, mindfulness as possible. Not from a place of self-abnegation, nor from a place of imposing ourselves on others. It's that balance where it's okay to be here, you are here, but not at the expense of someone else, and it's okay for them to be here, but not at the expense of you.
Say more about the word elegance, please. Because, again, I wholeheartedly agree. I want to walk with more elegance, as an example, right? So how do you then cultivate elegance?
Well, I think elegance comes from a different set of factors, but one of them is confidence. And we have a tendency to equate confidence with cockiness. And confidence is not cockiness. It's confidence can be even simple. It doesn't need to be flaunting. in fact, sometimes when we see somebody who is extrovertedly looks confident, they're actually really awkward. You know, they're actually inelegant. They can be overbearing at times, or kind of a bit show-offish. You know? So elegance is this idea of, to me, so again, my version of it,
Sure.
really comes from being confident, but not necessarily cocky. That's one of the aspects.
Being confident but not cocky.
And then elegance comes also from, I want to say, familiarity, as in the more we do something, the more we're familiar with it, the more elegant we become at it. Yeah? So me as a musician, the more I practice my scales, obviously the more elegant I can play as a musician. And then having enough of an open-mindedness to adapt, and a willingness to be flexible. I think elegance comes from a certain degree of inner flexibility, the willingness to adapt to what comes our way. So I'll give you an example. When you're a kid, if you first learn to walk and you hobble, but the more you walk, the better at it you become, then you can actually stand on your legs. But one of the things that makes you elegant is eventually the ability to negotiate obstacles. As you walk, and as your parents allow you outside of this more protective space that they first keep you in, like the little pen, little box where you're safe there. But as you walk outside and you start walking in nature, you will start encountering a step, a puddle, a rock. And so it's elegance comes from the ability to adapt to the terrain of life, as a child does eventually learn to run through fields of boulders and not fall. And parkour, right? Parkour is really elegant. It's really cool. So in a way, it's willingness to both have the skill to walk and the willingness to adapt that skill to what comes your way from a place of confidence, because you cannot do parkour if you're not confident.
Right.
You will hurt yourself, right?
Sure. If you hesitate,
you can't.
Doubt yourself.
And you also can't do it if you're cocky, because you will also hurt yourself.
Correct.
So it's that line of being confident enough to engage life, but flexible enough to adapt to the obstacles that come your way, or the things that are unpredictable, the things you cannot actually necessarily control. Because if you try to control everything, then you become one of these control freaks, and that's not necessarily desirable.
That's a very elegant way to put it.
So, and I think that's one of the ways to hold that masculine space. It's again, it's more of a how to be masculine, and that's my approach. I'm trying to practice that. Trying to attempt at being elegant if I can, and how I navigate the terrain of the masculine and the feminine.
I mean, I just, in spending the last 48 hours with you, you definitely demonstrated to me a lot of the elegance, right? Because, case in point, you got an unexpected request of someone visiting your ranch, and your response was elegant. You have a thumbs up, and that was it. Versus the process of, you have two other people, women, right? You're deciding. It's a beautiful solution. I don't know what you call it. Solution, reaction, choice. So it's beautiful. Last question. How do you cultivate the relationship? Because time is limited, right? Our time and our energy is limited on this planet, right? So the way I look at what one is truly committed to is based on how they allocate this limited resource we call time and energy. So how do you how do you choose who to cultivate more relationship with?
Well, first I'll invite you to considering that they're not limited, they're finite.
Okay. What's the difference? Finite and limited?
Well, a finite resource is the fact that it's finite does not mean it's has limitations. It just means it's more valuable, it's more precious.
Okay.
Right? There's a finite amount of diamonds or gold or whatever,
Sure.
but they're not limited resources. So it's a distinction. It's playing with linguistics to engage that experience from a more ease.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Finite. Thank
It's
you.
just an invitation.
Yeah, no, it's great. I love it.
So yes, time is valuable. It's finite. We only have so many hours in a day, so many years ahead of us, and what we choose to do, how we curate, effectively. That's really where I'm down to. I'm down to curating certain things. A little bit the way one learns over time to curate what one eats. When you're a kid, you just want to eat candy and
Right.
you want to cookies,
Right.
and even as a teenager, mostly you just want to screw around, and it's fun to eat burgers and fries and whatever. And your metabolism can take a lot of abuse when you're young. And then as you get older, you start to realize, maybe I might eat a little less greasy fries and burgers, I'll eat a little bit more salad. And the intention is to curate more lasting, more lasting health. No? And you do that by choosing to eat more salad, less French fries, and more fish, maybe a little less red meat, or whatever works for you. You find over time your own diet, literally. Eventually you get to an age where you're like, no, actually, although I like nibble a little bit on this and that, but I prefer eating this, better for me to do this. And I do the same thing with time. Over years I've just learned to curate my time and go, I would rather spend my time doing this than that because it's better for me. I'll feel better tomorrow, I'll feel better next week. And over time, that will translate into a healthier person. And with no judgment towards anyone in particular, but I do the same thing with people. There's some people where sometimes and it's fun, I still eat a greasy burger once in a while. It's like not like I never do it. And sometimes I like, a candy bar or whatever. But I'm just not going to make it part of my regular diet because I think it's better if I eat more healthy, balanced. And the same thing with sometimes activities or people where I've just learned to curate and be more selective as to what I do, just for long-term sustainability. And we're back to functionality. I can be more functional that way.
Beautiful. Thank you. So, any lasting words that you wanted to leave with listeners about if they can remember only one thing out of everything that you said so far? What would be the one thing that you wanted to remind them?
Yeah, I'd have to ponder it a little bit. But the first thing that comes to mind is that nobody's truth is your truth. That only doesn't matter how many teachers you read, how many people you listen to, and how many interviews you listen to. And I used to read a lot of biographies, and they were great sources of inspiration and motivation. And in some cases, they definitely inspired me to remain curious, and they began this inquiry. But that fundamentally, only truth that really has any relevance is that which you discover yourself, for yourself, by yourself, and that it's best to walk away from anybody else's idea in the long run, and consider them, add to the experience, but then synthesize them in your own way, and then contribute to the conversation, because I think we're all in this mutual discovery. It's an inquiry. Remain in the question, listen to other people's questions, and consider them, but don't necessarily become the devotee of anybody else's idea, because it'll still be someone else's idea.
Beautifully said.
You're your own. So I think it might be in Ram Dass or someone who said that fundamentally you are your own guru. when you're done chasing after everybody else's guru, then you find out that the teacher is with you always, and it's teaching you through your own desires, your own successes, and what sometimes seems like your own failures. They're all your own teachers, and they'll get you one step closer to becoming yourself.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Yeah.
Lastly, if someone's inspired to follow your music or your screenplays or your soon-to-be published philosophical book, maybe, where can they go to find out more about you?
Well, so I just want to correct something. I wrote a couple of screenplays when I was very young. I don't write screenplays. It has been many decades since I've done that. I do write, but not screenplays. Although I might do it again someday. But
you never know.
Who knows? You never know.
Right.
But that's that was one of my early interests when I was young.
Got it.
It's been a long time. I have a website called Bergeaud.com.
Can you spell that for us?
Bergeaud, Bergeaud.com. That I periodically put updates and things that I'm currently in the process of creating or sharing with people. Yeah.
I want to thank you. I want to acknowledge you for just sharing so generously who you are. I would assert your wisdom
Thank you.
To allow us to go to different places and really as a key reminder to remember to enjoy every step of the journey. I will report back on my journey to learn music. So thank you for the inspiration.
Of course. You're most welcome. Thank you so much for spending a lovely couple of days together.
Yeah.
It's really a pleasure to be in your company and get to know you, and also get to learn from you, because it's a joint conversation. You know, I really thoroughly enjoyed our conversations together, and I discovered just as many things through these conversations. So thank you for that.
Hence the reason we do the podcast.
Yeah.
All right, guys, have a beautiful rest of the day.
Thanks.
Take care.